Jacob had always believed in the power of education to change lives. From the moment he stepped into his first classroom, he knew he had found his calling. The students, with their wide eyes and eager minds, were like blank canvases waiting to be painted with knowledge, kindness, and hope. Jacob didn't just teach them math and science, he taught them how to be human, how to care for one another, how to stand up for what was right, and how to dream beyond the confines of their small town. Every morning, he arrived at school before anyone else, his briefcase filled with lesson plans and his heart filled with purpose. He greeted each student by name, asking about their families, their hobbies, their dreams. To Jacob, they weren't just students. They were his children, his legacy. He poured his soul into every lesson, every conversation, every moment spent in that classroom. But one day, everything changed. It started with a rumor, a whisper in the staff room. The school fund, a pool of money collected for field trips, supplies, and special projects, was missing a significant amount. At first, no one thought much of it. Perhaps it was a clerical error, a misplaced check, or a simple misunderstanding. But as the days passed and the money failed to reappear, the whispers grew louder, the accusations more pointed. Jacob didn't pay much attention to the gossip. He had nothing to hide. He had always been transparent about his finances, meticulous in his record-keeping, and unwavering in his integrity. But when the principal called him into his office one afternoon, Jacob's world began to unravel. "Jacob," the principal began, his voice heavy with regret. "There's been an investigation into the missing funds, and your name has come up." Jacob stared at him, uncomprehending. "My name? Why?" The principal hesitated, avoiding Jacob's gaze. "There were discrepancies in the records, payments that were logged under your name, but no receipts to back them up. And, well, some of the staff have mentioned seeing you in the office late at night, around the time the money went missing." Jacob's heart sank. "That's because I was grading papers," he said, his voice trembling. "I always stay late to grade papers. You know that." The principal sighed. "I believe you, Jacob. But the school board, they're under a lot of pressure. They need someone to take responsibility." Jacob felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "I would never steal from my own students. Never." But the evidence, though weak and circumstantial, was enough to condemn him. The school board, eager to resolve the scandal, decided to make an example of him. Jacob was suspended pending further investigation, and the news spread like wildfire through the small town. The once respected teacher became the subject of gossip and scorn. Parents whispered behind his back, students avoided his gaze, and colleagues who had once called him a friend now treated him like a stranger. Jacob felt as though he were living in a nightmare, one from which he couldn't wake up. The trial was a blur. Jacob sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched in his lap, as the prosecutor painted him as a greedy, manipulative thief. The evidence against him was flimsy at best. A few unexplained entries in the ledger, a vague testimony from a janitor who claimed to have seen him near the office late at night. But it was enough to sway the jury. When the verdict was read, Jacob felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. "Guilty?" The word echoed in his ears, a death sentence to his career, his reputation, and his freedom. 10 years. That's what they gave him. 10 years of his life, gone in an instant. As the prison gates closed behind him, Jacob felt the weight of injustice crush his spirit. He had always believed in fairness, in truth, in the goodness of people. But now, those beliefs felt like a cruel joke. In his cell, Jacob would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had come to this. He replayed every moment, every interaction, searching for answers that never came. The days turned into months, the months into years, and Jacob's hope began to fade. He felt like a ghost, a shadow of the man he once was. The world outside moved on without him, but Jacob remained trapped, not just by bars, but by the weight of a lie. He wondered if anyone would ever remember him, if anyone would ever care. And then, one day, a letter arrived, a glimmer of light in the darkness. The envelope arrived on a cold, gray morning, its edges frayed from passing through too many hands. Jacob held it gingerly, as though it might disintegrate at the slightest touch. The return address, Greenwood Elementary School, sent a jolt through him. It had been years since he'd seen that name, years since he'd allowed himself to think about the life he'd lost. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in a hurried, almost desperate hand. The confession was brief, but damning. Someone had taken the money, someone had framed him. And now, after all these years, that someone was finally coming forward. Jacob's hands trembled as he read the letter again, his eyes lingering on the final line. "I'm sorry." The apology felt hollow, meaningless against the weight of a decade stolen from his life. But it was the signature, or rather, the lack of one, that haunted him. The writer had chosen to remain anonymous, as though their guilt could be erased by the simple act of confession. For a moment, Jacob sat frozen, the letter clutched in his hands. Then, slowly, the numbness gave way to a flood of emotions: anger, relief, disbelief. He had spent years in this cell, clinging to the hope that the truth would one day come to light, and now that it had, he wasn't sure what to do with it. The memory came unbidden, sharp and vivid, as though it had been waiting for this moment to resurface. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that turned the school's linoleum floors into a hazard and sent students scurrying for cover. Jacob had stayed late, as he often did, to finish grading a stack of essays. The office was quiet, the only sound the steady drumming of rain against the windows. He remembered the way the fluorescent lights had buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the room. He remembered the faint smell of coffee and the faint hum of the photocopier in the corner. And he remembered Sarah, the school secretary, sitting at her desk, her face pale and drawn. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Sarah had always been quiet, reserved, the kind of person who faded into the background. But now, as he replayed the memory in his mind, he noticed the details he'd missed. The way her hands had trembled as she shuffled papers, the way she'd avoided his gaze when he said goodnight. He hadn't known it then, but she had been carrying a secret, one that would change both of their lives forever. The pieces began to fall into place, each one sharper and more painful than the last. Sarah had been the one to handle the school fund, the one who kept the records and balanced the books. She had access, opportunity, and, as Jacob now realized, motive. He thought about the trial, the way the prosecution had painted him as a greedy, manipulative thief. They had used his late nights at the school against him, twisting his dedication into something sinister. And all the while, Sarah had sat in the courtroom, her face a mask of quiet guilt. Why had she stayed silent? Why had she let him take the fall for her crime? The questions burned in his mind, each one more unanswerable than the last. But even as anger simmered in his chest, Jacob felt a flicker of something else. Pity. Sarah had been a single mother, struggling to make ends meet. She had made a terrible choice, one born of desperation rather than malice. And now, it seemed, the weight of that choice had finally become too much to bear. The letter changed everything. It was proof of his innocence, a chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. But it also came with a moral dilemma, one that Jacob hadn't anticipated. If he came forward with the letter, Sarah would be exposed. Her life would be ruined, just as his had been. Did she deserve that? Or was there another way, a way to seek justice without destroying another person in the process? Jacob sat on the edge of his bunk, the letter resting in his lap. Outside, the prison yard was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of shouting and clanging metal replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide. For the first time in years, Jacob felt a spark of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of the choice before him, a choice that would define not just his future, but Sarah's as well. In the end, it wasn't anger or a desire for revenge that guided his decision. It was the memory of his students, their faces, their laughter, the way they had looked up to him as a role model. He had taught them to be kind, to be honest, to do the right thing even when it was hard. And now, it was his turn to live by those lessons. Jacob folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He would come forward, but not to destroy Sarah. He would come forward to seek the truth, to clear his name, and to remind the world that even in the face of injustice, there was justice, there was still room for compassion. As he stood and walked toward the prison's administration office, Jacob felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt like himself again. The courtroom felt smaller than Jacob remembered, or perhaps it was the weight of the past decade that made the walls seem closer, the air thicker. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes fixed on the judge's empty seat. The room buzzed with murmurs, the sound of shuffling papers, and the occasional cough. It was familiar, yet alien, a place he had hoped never to see again. The letter sat in his pocket, a silent witness to the truth. He had handed it over to his lawyer, a weary but determined man named Thomas, who had fought tirelessly to reopen the case. Thomas had warned him that the road ahead would be brutal, that the prosecution would fight tooth and nail to discredit the confession. But Jacob had nodded, his resolve unshaken. He had nothing left to lose, except the chance to reclaim his name. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Jacob turned instinctively. A group of people filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Among them, he spotted Sarah. She looked older, her once vibrant hair now streaked with gray, her shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible burden. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Jacob saw the flicker of guilt, of fear, before she quickly looked away. Sarah took the stand, her hands trembling as she placed them on the wooden railing. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. She spoke softly at first, her voice barely audible, but as she recounted the events of that rainy afternoon, her words grew stronger, more resolute. She told the court about the mounting bills, the sleepless nights, the desperation that had driven her to take the money. She described the moment she had seen Jacob in the office, how she had hidden in the shadows, her heart pounding with fear. And she admitted, her voice breaking, that she had stayed silent during the trial, too afraid to face the consequences of her actions. The room seemed to hold its breath as she finished, her confession hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jacob watched her, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, pity, and relief. She had stolen 10 years of his life, but she had also carried the weight of her guilt for just as long. The prosecution was relentless. They painted Sarah as a liar, a manipulator trying to shift blame onto an innocent man. They questioned her motives, her timing, her credibility. Had she come forward out of guilt, or was she simply seeking attention? Why now, after all these years? Jacob's lawyer fought back, presenting evidence that supported Sarah's confession. Bank records, witness testimonies, and the letter itself. But the prosecution's arguments were sharp, their tone dismissive. It was clear they had no intention of letting Jacob walk away without a fight. Through it all, Jacob sat quietly, his hands clenched in his lap. He had expected this, had braced himself for the onslaught. But hearing the lies, the half-truths, the twisted narratives was harder than he had anticipated. It was as though the past 10 years were being rewritten before his eyes, his innocence still just out of reach. Just as the tension in the room reached its peak, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. This time, a group of young adults filed in, their faces determined, their presence commanding attention. Jacob recognized them instantly, his former students. There was Emma, now a confident young woman with a notebook still clutched in her hands. Beside her stood Michael, who had once struggled with math but now worked as an engineer. And there were others, their faces a blur of memories and pride. They had come to support him, to stand by the man who had once stood by them. One by one, they took the stand, sharing stories of how Jacob had inspired them, how he had taught them to be kind, to persevere, to believe in themselves. Their words were a stark contrast to the prosecution's narrative, a reminder of the man Jacob had been, and still was. Emma was the last to speak. She held up the notebook she had given Jacob all those years ago, the one with the story titled, "The Teacher Who Believed in Me." "Mr. Miller didn't just teach us math and science," she said, her voice steady. "He taught us how to be human. And even after everything he's been through, he's still the kindest, most honest person I know." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a blanket. Even the judge seemed moved, his stern expression softening as he listened. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Jacob sat in the hallway, his former students gathered around him, their presence a quiet but powerful source of strength. Sarah sat a few feet away, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the verdict was finally announced, Jacob felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Not guilty. The words echoed in the courtroom, a balm to his wounded soul. But the victory felt bittersweet. He was free, but the scars of the past decade would never fully heal. As he walked out of the courtroom, his students by his side, Jacob felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was no longer alone. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, not just for himself, but for the future he had helped shape through the lives of his students. The sunlight felt foreign on Jacob's skin as he stepped out of the courthouse. The weight of the past decade momentarily lifted. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn day that used to fill him with joy, back when he had a life to call his own. Now, it felt like stepping into a world that had moved on without him. His former students surrounded him, their faces a mix of relief and pride. Emma handed him the notebook she had held during the trial, the one with the story she'd written about him all those years ago. "You kept it," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," she replied, her eyes shining. "You're the reason I became a writer." For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to smile, but the joy was fleeting, overshadowed by the enormity of what lay ahead. He was free. But freedom came with its own set of challenges, rebuilding his life, reclaiming his identity, and finding a way to move forward. Sarah waited for him outside the courthouse, her face pale and drawn. She approached hesitantly, as though unsure of her right to be there. "Jacob," she began, her voice trembling, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know how sorry I am." Jacob studied her, his emotions a tangled mess. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but it was tempered by a strange sense of pity. She had been desperate, just as he had been desperate to prove his innocence. And now, they were both free. But at what cost? "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I don't want to carry this anger anymore. It's eaten enough of my life already." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered before turning and walking away. Jacob watched her go, the weight of her apology settling over him. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something he could give lightly, but it was something he could work toward, one day at a time. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and awkward conversations. Jacob's teaching license had been revoked, and reinstating it would take time he wasn't sure he had. He moved into a small apartment, the walls bare and the silence deafening. His students visited often, bringing food, books, and stories of their lives. They were a lifeline, a reminder that he had made a difference, even in the darkest of times. But their visits couldn't fill the void left by the life he had lost. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Jacob found himself staring at the notebook Emma had given him. He flipped through the pages, his eyes lingering on the story she had written about him. "The teacher who believed in me." The words struck a chord deep within him. He had believed in his students, even when no one had believed in him. And now, it was their belief in him that was keeping him afloat. The call came on a rainy afternoon, just as Jacob was beginning to lose hope. It was from a small community center on the outskirts of town. They had heard his story and wanted to offer him a job, teaching adults who had fallen through the cracks of the education system. "It's not much," the director said apologetically, "but we think you'd be a perfect fit." Jacob hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't set foot in a classroom in over a decade. Could he still do it? Could he still make a difference? The answer came to him as he hung up the phone. He didn't know if he could, but he owed it to himself and to the students who had stood by him to try. The community center was nothing like the school Jacob had once called home. The walls were cracked, the chairs mismatched, and the students wary. But as he stood at the front of the room, a familiar feeling washed over him, a sense of purpose, of belonging. "My name is Jacob Miller," he began, his voice steady, "and I'm here because I believe in second chances." The room was silent, the students' eyes fixed on him. For the first time in years, Jacob felt like himself again. Months passed, and Jacob's new life began to take shape. His students, former convicts, single parents, and struggling immigrants, found solace in his kindness and patience. He taught them math, English, and life skills, but more importantly, he taught them to believe in themselves. One evening, as he was packing up his things, Emma stopped by with a gift, a framed photo of his old class, taken on the last day of school before his arrest. "I thought you might want this," she said, her voice soft. Jacob took the photo, his eyes filling with tears. The faces staring back at him were a reminder of the life he had lost and the life he had gained. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me." Emma smiled. "You taught us to believe in ourselves. It's only fair we return the favor." As Jacob walked home that night, the photo clutched in his hands, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had lost 10 years of his life, but he had gained something far more precious: a second chance, a renewed purpose, and the enduring love of those he had inspired. And as he looked up at the stars, Jacob realized that his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Word of Jacob's new role at the community center spread quickly, and soon the small classroom was filled to capacity. People came from all walks of life, some out of curiosity, others out of desperation, but all drawn by the story of the teacher who had lost everything and still found a way to give back. Jacob's lessons went beyond textbooks. He taught resilience, kindness, and the importance of second chances. His students, many of whom had been written off by society, began to flourish under his guidance. They found jobs, mended broken relationships, and, most importantly, rediscovered their self-worth. One student, a young man named Marcus, approached Jacob after class one evening. "I heard what happened to you," Marcus said, his voice hesitant, "and I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on us, even after everything you've been through." Jacob smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "We all deserve a second chance," he replied, "including me." Sarah's confession had cost her dearly. She lost her job, her reputation, and the respect of many in the community, but it had also given her a chance to start anew. One day, she showed up at the community center, her face lined with worry, but her eyes filled with determination. "I want to help," she said simply. "However I can." Jacob hesitated, the old wounds still fresh. But he saw the sincerity in her eyes and nodded. Sarah started small, organizing files and helping with paperwork. But as the weeks passed, she began to take on more responsibilities, her natural talent for administration shining through. Slowly, she and Jacob found a way to work together, their shared history a silent but powerful bond. One evening, as they sat in the empty classroom, Sarah turned to Jacob. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quietly, "but I want you to know how grateful I am for this chance." Jacob looked at her, his expression softening. "We've both lost enough," he said. "It's time to move forward." Jacob's story caught the attention of a local filmmaker who approached him with an idea, a documentary about his life, his wrongful conviction, and his work at the community center. At first, Jacob was hesitant. The thought of reliving the past was daunting, but the filmmaker assured him that the focus would be on hope, resilience, and the power of second chances. The documentary, titled "The Teacher Who Never Gave Up," premiered to a packed theater. Jacob sat in the front row, flanked by his students, former and current, as the screen came to life with his story. The film was raw and emotional, but it was also filled with moments of triumph. Jacob's acquittal, his work at the community center, and the lives he had touched along the way. When the credits rolled, the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the theater. Jacob stood, his eyes filled with tears, as his students surrounded him, their faces glowing with pride. The documentary brought unexpected opportunities. Jacob was invited to speak at schools, prisons, and community events, sharing his story and inspiring others to believe in the power of second chances. One such event took him back to Greenwood Elementary, the place where it had all begun. The school had changed. New faces, new programs, new challenges, but the spirit of the students was the same. As Jacob stood at the front of the auditorium, he looked out at the sea of young faces and felt a surge of emotion. Life is unpredictable, he began, his voice steady. It can knock you down, but it's up to you to get back up. And when you do, you'll find that you're stronger than you ever imagined. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with wonder. And as Jacob spoke, he realized that he had come full circle, from teacher to prisoner, from prisoner to advocate, and now back to teacher once more. Years passed, and Jacob's work at the community center grew into a full-fledged program, offering education, job training, and support to those in need. The center became a beacon of hope, a place where people could find not just a second chance, but a new beginning. One day, as Jacob was preparing for class, Emma walked in, a young boy by her side. "This is my son, Liam," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I wanted him to meet the man who inspired me to never give up." Jacob knelt down, his eyes meeting Liam's. "It's nice to meet you, Liam," he said, his voice warm. The boy smiled shyly. "Mom says you're a hero." Jacob chuckled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm just a teacher," he replied, "but if I've inspired even one person, then I've done my job." Closing. A life of meaning. As Jacob walked home that evening, the sun setting in a blaze of colors, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led him here, to a life of purpose, of connection, of hope. He had lost 10 years of his life, but he had gained something far more precious, a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. And as he looked up at the stars, Jacob realized that his story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone he had touched, everyone he had inspired, and everyone who had inspired him in return. The ripple effect of his journey would continue, spreading hope and kindness far beyond what he could ever imagine. The community center was alive with laughter, music, and the hum of conversation. It was the 10th anniversary of Jacob's program, and the room was filled with faces. Old and new, familiar and unexpected. Former students, now thriving in their careers, mingled with current participants, their stories a testament to the power of second chances. Jacob stood at the front of the room, a quiet smile on his face as he watched the crowd. Emma was there, her son Liam now a bright-eyed teenager. Marcus, who had once struggled to find his place, was now a successful tradesman, mentoring others in the program. Even Sarah was there, her once guilty expression replaced by one of quiet pride. As Jacob stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. 10 years ago, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I stood in a courtroom, my life in ruins. I had lost everything, my job, my reputation, my freedom. But what I didn't realize then was that I hadn't lost the most important thing, the ability to make a difference. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. This program, this community, has given me more than I could ever give in return. It's shown me that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back. And it's reminded me that kindness, resilience, and hope are the most powerful forces in the world. The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the walls and filling Jacob's heart with warmth. As the celebration wound down, Jacob found himself surrounded by his students, past and present. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, their gratitude palpable. Emma approached him, her eyes shining. You've changed so many lives, Jacob, including mine. Jacob smiled, his heart swelling with pride. And you've changed mine, he replied. All of you have. Later, as he was preparing to leave, Sarah stopped him at the door. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but sincere, for giving me a second chance. Jacob nodded, his expression kind but firm. We all deserve one, he said, but it's up to us to make the most of it. The following week, Jacob stood in front of a new class, their faces eager and hopeful. Among them was Liam, Emma's son, who had decided to follow in his mother's footsteps and pursue a career in writing. Welcome, Jacob said, his voice warm and inviting. This is a place of new beginnings. No matter where you've been or what you've been through, you have the power to change your story. As he began the lesson, Jacob felt a sense of fulfillment unlike anything he had ever known. He had come full circle, from teacher to prisoner, from prisoner to advocate, and now back to teacher once more. That evening, Jacob sat on the porch of his small home, a cup of tea in his hands and the stars twinkling above. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain, the loss, the redemption. He had lost 10 years of his life, but he had gained something far more precious, a legacy of hope, kindness, and resilience. He had touched countless lives, inspired countless stories, and created a ripple effect that would continue long after he was gone. As he looked up at the stars, Jacob felt a deep sense of peace. His story wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it was far from over. Jacob's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, light can still shine through. His program continued to grow, touching lives and changing futures. His students carried his lessons with them, spreading kindness and resilience wherever they went. And Jacob, he continued to teach, to inspire, and to believe in the power of second chances. Because in the end, it wasn't about the years he had lost. It was about the lives he had touched, the hope he had given, and the legacy he had built. And that, Jacob realized, was a life well lived.